Something doesn't quite add up in the official account coming out of Washington this week. In the aftermath of the frightening incident at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, the administration has been pushing a very specific story, one that is now facing serious questions, not from political opponents but from the administration's own officials when pressed under direct questioning. Let's be clear about what we do know. A man named Cole Thomas Allen, 31 years old from Torrance, California, was arrested on the night of April 25th at the Washington Hilton Hotel, where the annual White House Correspondents' Association dinner was taking place. President Trump, Vice President Vance, First Lady Melania Trump, and numerous senior administration officials were in attendance. When gunfire erupted outside the ballroom, they were evacuated. A Secret Service officer was struck and protected by a bulletproof vest. The suspect was subdued at the scene. Those are the core established facts. But then the questions begin. One of the central claims circulating in the immediate aftermath was that the suspect fired on a federal officer and hit them. Yet, when Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche was asked point-blank at a press conference whether the suspect actually fired shots, and specifically whose bullet struck the agent, his answer was, to put it charitably, unusually cautious for an administration that has never shown much reluctance to get ahead of facts when those facts serve the political narrative. When asked directly whether the gunman fired shots, how many he fired, and specifically who fired the bullet that struck the agent, Blanche said the following, and this is important to absorb carefully. He said, "It appears that there were 5 shots fired by law enforcement." He said that based on the complaint, the defendant did discharge his shotgun and that, quote, "We know that happened." But on the specific question of ballistics, who fired what, and whose bullet actually hit the officer, Blanche declined to give a definitive answer, saying the evidence is still being examined and that getting into exacting ballistics was something he wasn't prepared to do that day. Now that is a remarkable statement. The Justice Department has charged this individual with attempted assassination of the president. The charges include the discharge of a firearm during a crime of violence. And yet, the Acting Attorney General of the United States is standing at a podium saying he cannot tell the American public whose bullet hit a federal officer. To be fair to Blanche, and we should be, the FBI director confirmed that shell casings and firearms were sent immediately to the laboratory at Quantico for analysis. This is standard forensic procedure, and the investigation is genuinely ongoing. But the combination of sweeping criminal charges on one hand and that kind of ballistic uncertainty on the other is the kind of disconnect that raises legitimate questions, not conspiratorial ones, legitimate ones. Let's talk about who this man actually is, because the picture that has emerged from law enforcement sources and court filings is striking. Cole Thomas Allen is 31 years old. He earned a mechanical engineering degree from the California Institute of Technology, one of the most prestigious scientific universities in the country, in 2017. He then went on to complete a master's degree in computer science from California State University, Dominguez Hills, in 2025. He worked as a tutor and part-time educator. Colleagues and students who knew him described him as entirely normal and friendly. A professor who taught him described him as a very good student, attentive, engaged, a presence in class. And yet, according to federal court documents, he traveled by train from Los Angeles to Chicago, and then Chicago to Washington, arriving the day before the dinner. He made a hotel reservation at the Washington Hilton for 3 nights. He was armed with a 12-gauge pump-action shotgun, purchased in August of 2025, a semi-automatic pistol he had owned since 2023, and multiple knives. He sent a note to his family members just minutes before the incident. In that note, he apologized to his parents, colleagues, students, and strangers who might be caught in what he was about to do. He described himself as a friendly federal assassin. He reportedly stated in writings that he believed it was his duty to target Trump administration officials. Federal prosecutors say he charged through a security checkpoint holding a long gun. A loud gunshot was heard. Law enforcement responded. He was tackled to the ground and suffered minor injuries, a scrape on his knee, according to authorities. He was transported briefly to Howard University Hospital before being released into law enforcement custody. He invoked his right to remain silent. He was arraigned in federal court, represented by a public defender, and charged with 3 counts: attempted assassination of the president, interstate transportation of a firearm and ammunition with intent to commit a felony, and discharge of a firearm during a crime of violence. The Justice Department is seeking pre-trial detention, arguing the charges constitute a federal crime of terrorism. Here is where the story takes a turn that many observers have found, at minimum, jarring. Within hours of a shooting incident in which the President of the United States was evacuated from a public event, the administration and its congressional allies pivoted, hard, to a very specific political agenda item: the White House Ballroom Project. For context, President Trump has already demolished the historic East Wing of the White House to begin construction on a massive 90,000-square-foot ballroom. The cost has been estimated at around $400 million. Trump previously stated that private donations would pay for it. That project has been legally contested. A federal judge ruled in March that the project could only proceed with congressional approval. The National Trust for Historic Preservation has been fighting it in court. Even as of this past weekend, the injunction on construction was temporarily on hold, with a hearing date looming in early June. Acting Attorney General Blanche used his press conference, the one in which he could not give definitive ballistics answers, to argue that there is no better example of why the ballroom is necessary than what happened Saturday night. He argued that Washington's existing venues force the president to hold large events in hotel environments that are, in his framing, fundamentally less secure. White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt echoed this framing, saying the ballroom is not just a fun project for the president. It is a critical national security necessity. She said the White House simply does not have a room large enough to accommodate the kind of gathering that took place at the Hilton, and that the ballroom would enable the entire line of presidential succession to gather in safety on secured grounds. Then came Senator Lindsey Graham. The Senate Budget Committee chairman held a press conference alongside fellow Republican Senators Katie Britt of Alabama and Eric Schmitt of Missouri to announce legislation that would authorize $400 million in federal taxpayer funding to build the ballroom. Graham said his estimate is that the actual cost would be $332 million, with costs offset by customs fees, and that private donations could be used for furnishings. But taxpayers, in his vision, should be funding the core security infrastructure. Graham argued that underneath the ballroom there would be military infrastructure, a Secret Service annex, and significant national security enhancements. He said the president should not have to leave the White House grounds and enter a commercial hotel environment for large gatherings. He cited what happened Saturday as proof positive that the concept of holding such events at a private venue is dangerous. "There are people out there," Graham said, "just one click away from picking up a gun and trying to make things better by killing." His argument was that the ballroom is not a vanity project. It's a national security imperative. He said he had spoken with President Trump that morning, and that the president himself had framed the need for the ballroom not just in terms of his own security, but for future presidents as well. Now, and this matters, this $400 million was previously something the White House insisted would be privately funded. The pivot to public funding is significant. Even within the Republican caucus, there is resistance. Senate Majority Leader John Thune said he isn't certain the ballroom can be funded through the reconciliation process. Some House Republicans also pushed back, saying private funding is more appropriate. Even Senator Rand Paul, who announced his own ballroom bill, insisted it should not add new taxpayer costs. So far, the only Democrat who has publicly signaled support for funding the ballroom is Senator John Fetterman of Pennsylvania. The rest of the Democratic caucus remains firmly opposed, arguing the project is unlawful without proper congressional authorization, that it sets a corruption precedent, and that the original promise of private funding should be honored. Let's turn now to something that deserves attention. Acting AG Blanche, during the same press conference, said something that should not pass without remark. When asked about the threat environment and what the DOJ's stance is, Blanche pointed a finger at journalists in the room. He said that when reporters and media figures are, in his words, overly critical of the president and calling him horrible names, without evidence or proof, it should not be surprising that this type of threat environment develops. He said many of the people in that room were just as guilty as some of the most inflammatory voices online. This is the acting Attorney General of the United States at a press conference about an active criminal prosecution, suggesting that the press corps covering that prosecution bears some responsibility for the very violence they are there to report on. That should be examined very carefully by anyone who cares about the role of journalism in a democratic society. FBI Director Kash Patel, for his part, offered a more straightforward accounting of the law enforcement response. He confirmed that shell casings and the firearms recovered from the scene were sent to the Quantico laboratory for immediate forensic analysis. He detailed the work of intelligence analysts, hostage rescue teams, and support staff who had been working without sleep since Saturday night. He acknowledged this is ongoing, intensive investigative work. He also called on the public to go out and thank a federal agent, to shake the hand of a law enforcement officer and express gratitude for their service. Now, on its face, that's an unremarkable sentiment. Federal agents did their job Saturday night. A suspected attacker was neutralized before he could reach the ballroom. No one in that ballroom was physically harmed. The system, at least in its most immediate sense, worked. But the political staging around that sentiment, the press conferences, the framing, the way these officials moved from "we don't have ballistics answers yet" to "thank every federal agent you see" within the same appearance, is worth noting as a matter of tone and optics. No conversation about this week would be complete without addressing the escalating battle over political rhetoric. White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt used her briefing to cite multiple Democratic politicians and suggest their language has contributed to a climate in which political violence becomes more likely. She specifically cited House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, who, days before Saturday's incident, said at a press conference, "We are in an era of maximum warfare, everywhere, all the time." Leavitt framed this as an example of inflammatory rhetoric that inspires disturbed individuals to act. Here is the important context that multiple fact-checking organizations have since confirmed. Jeffries made that remark specifically in reference to the redistricting battle. It was a direct echo of a phrase that originated, remarkably, from within the Trump White House itself. A senior administration official used the exact words "maximum warfare, everywhere, all the time" to describe the White House's own political strategy in a New York Times report from August 2025. Jeffries was essentially throwing the administration's own language back at them in the context of a legislative fight over congressional maps. Jeffries, when asked at his own press conference whether he would tone down the language given the circumstances, was not having it. He defended his remarks, condemned political violence in unambiguous terms, and went on the offense. He called Leavitt a stone-cold liar for presenting Democratic statements without context. He pointed to January 6, to the pardons of individuals convicted of assaulting law enforcement officers. He noted that one of those pardoned individuals had subsequently threatened his life. He mentioned the arson attack on the home of Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro while Shapiro's family was inside. He argued that the party now lecturing Democrats about civility was the same party that provided, in his words, aid and comfort to violent insurrectionists who beat police officers at the United States Capitol. That is a combustible political environment by any measure. And then there is the Jimmy Kimmel question. On Thursday, 2 days before Saturday's incident, late-night host Jimmy Kimmel aired a segment on his show that was billed as an alternative version of the White House Correspondents' Dinner. In that segment, he said of First Lady Melania Trump, "Mrs. Trump, you have a glow like an expectant widow." It was a dark joke. Dark jokes are a long-standing tradition at the Correspondents' Dinner and its surrounding commentary culture. 2 days later, a gunman tried to breach the security checkpoint of the actual dinner. President Trump went on Truth Social and called Kimmel's joke really shocking and drew a direct line between Kimmel's remarks and the shooting. He called for Kimmel to be immediately fired by ABC and its parent company Disney. Melania Trump separately issued a statement calling the joke hateful and violent rhetoric, and accused Kimmel of deepening the political sickness within America. Press Secretary Leavitt asked at her briefing, "Who in their right mind says a wife would be glowing over the potential murder of her beloved husband?" This is where the line between legitimate criticism and political opportunism gets genuinely complicated. There is no evidence, none, in any of the publicly available documents or court filings connecting Cole Allen's actions to Jimmy Kimmel's joke. Allen's own writings, shared with his family, reflect a political grievance that had been building for some time, centered on his views about the Trump administration. Those writings do not reference Kimmel. They were written and scheduled to be sent before the show aired. But the charge has been made. It has been amplified by the White House itself, and it is circulating. Here is what this reporter's assessment comes down to after going through all of it. Whether or not every detail of the official account of Saturday night is accurate, and the ballistics questions are real and worth watching, what the administration has done in the aftermath is something voters should observe very carefully. Within hours of a serious security incident, the White House and its allies had pivoted from the incident itself to a legislative agenda. Get the ballroom funded, change the protest environment, blame the media, challenge comedians. The response was not solemn, it was strategic. A suspect is in federal custody, facing serious charges. The evidence will be examined in court. Due process will proceed. Those are the appropriate mechanisms for establishing truth. What is not appropriate, from any direction, is the immediate, reflexive weaponization of an attempted act of violence for political ends, before the forensic evidence is even fully analyzed. The American public deserves better. That applies across the board, to everyone in this story, on every side of it.